A man loses his re-election for sheriff, and he, of course, acts like a mature adult and concedes. Correct? No. Instead, he orchestrates a murder. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Derwin Brown. Viewer discretion is advised. Derwin Brown was born on June 22nd, 1954 in Fort Knox, Kentucky. His family would then move to Long Island, New York, where he spent the majority of his younger life. He would graduate from Malvern High School there in New York, and then eventually he would make his way to Decatur, Georgia, where he soon met Phyllis Oliver, who would soon become Phyllis Brown, because he fell head over heels in love with her, and the two of them would marry. Then they went on to have 5 wonderful, beautiful children together. In the early 70s, he became a youth counselor, which focused on troubled teens. Derwin would also attend nearly every single community meeting because he cared very much about his community. He was just a very involved citizen at the time, and then he just wanted to make sure that his community was safe, that it was clean, that everything was running smoothly. And then by 1977, he would end up joining the DeKalb County Sheriff's Department. He was one of the very first black police officers to work for that department. He was as honorable and as respected a member of that department as you could possibly get. He did everything by the book. He followed the rules. He did not take advantage of his power. He upheld the law the way the law was meant to be upheld. He would actually go on to serve in the sheriff's department for 23 years. And along the way, he had his own weekly column in the newspaper, and it was a column called Tell It Like It Is. And then he also had his own segment on a weekly local news channel, and that segment was called The Naked Truth. After 23 years of being in the sheriff's department, he decided he wanted to step up his game. He wanted to advance his career, and he wanted to do something that he felt would better the community. So he ran for sheriff. And in 1999/2000, he would get that opportunity when he would run for sheriff, which was up for re-election. He would go against the current sheriff, Sheriff Sidney Dorsey. He was elected sheriff in 1996, and he, in fact, was the very first African-American sheriff in DeKalb County. Sidney Dorsey was born on February 23rd, 1940, and he lived his entire life in Atlanta, Georgia. He would later go on to become a detective in Atlanta, and this was in the 70s or so. His claim to fame, so to speak, came with the Atlanta child murders investigation. Between 1979 and 1982, approximately 30 children, teenagers, young adults were murdered. And it was widely believed to be they were all committed by the same person. A task force was developed fairly early on in the investigation of the Atlanta child murderer. And this consisted of well over 100 different agents. One of those people was Sidney Dorsey. And in 1981, he was one of the leading detectives or officers to serve a warrant on the potential suspect of the Atlanta child murders. And that suspect was 23-year-old Wayne Williams. Now, Wayne Williams would go on to be convicted of 2 murders of adults who were Nathaniel Carter and Jimmy Ray Payne. Now, he says he was completely innocent in those murders, but apparently they had enough evidence to actually convict him of those 2 murders of the adults. He was widely considered to be, or believed to be, also the Atlanta child murderer. So when he was convicted, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the 2 murders that they were able to, I guess, link to him. They never were able to actually charge him with or prosecute him or indict him for any of the child murders, even though they say they fully believe that he was responsible for at least 24 of them, if not all of them. But that evidence has never actually been presented, so is he that guy? Who knows? That's a different video. Sidney Dorsey, even back in the initial investigation, he pretty much always thought that there wasn't enough to say that Williams was a murderer at all. And he was one of the people that was more outspoken about him saying that he doesn't believe that Williams was at all the child murderer. He said that he would not stop until the children's families got their justice and their closure. He said that he owed it to the victims' families to make sure they caught the actual person, but he never did. He never actually fulfilled that promise. He did attempt to reopen the investigation in the 90s or so, but that was apparently unsuccessful. By the way, in recent years, I think it was 2019 where they did actually reopen the Atlanta child murders case, but I don't think they ever came to any conclusion, at least not as of yet. So with this, with him coming out publicly saying, I don't think Williams was the guy, I want to make sure he's the guy, I want to get justice for the families, he was perceived to be this really good guy, this solid cop, solid detective. Everyone respected him. So in 1996, when he ran for sheriff, he won. And that was pretty exciting news. But shortly after he was elected as sheriff, the public's opinion of him would essentially begin to change, because it became belief that he may have been a corrupt sheriff. He was accused of sexual assaults by a few women, sexual harassment at the very least, but nothing ever came from that. However, he did do some very nefarious things as sheriff. He would use county vehicles and county gas for his own personal use, for his own personal profit. He would make his deputies chauffeur him and his family around wherever they needed to go, and he did this while the deputies were on the clock being paid by the county. Like, he would make the deputies use the sheriff's department vehicles to pick his kids up from school, drop them off in the morning, little things like that while they were on the clock as deputies. It's just... This is a big no-no, by the way. You're not supposed to do that. He even authorized overtime payment for these deputies to continue doing personal things for him outside of their actual deputy, needs and services that they need to be providing. He utilized the deputies to be mechanics. Instead of paying a mechanic to fix his personal vehicles, he would just have the deputies do it for them while, again, the county is paying for them. He made one of them go with him and drive his family to Walt Disney World in Florida, and basically act as their chauffeur, and made this deputy do whatever they needed him to do, again, on county time and county money. Dorsey also used the county's lawyers for his own personal use, for whatever personal issues he had. He just used the lawyers on county's dime. He also owned his own private security firm, and instead of hiring individuals and paying them himself, he just pulled deputies from the force, threw them in his security firm, and just had the county pay for them, Now, none of this sounds like horrific, like, oh my god, I can't believe he did this, what a scandal. Well, I guess minus the sexual assaults and, allegations of harassment and whatnot. But, he didn't, wasn't doing anything involving drugs or murders or anything like that. But it's still unethical, and it's still very much actually against the law, because there's racketeering laws and whatnot. So he was doing illegal things, and this would, make him a very corrupt sheriff. These deputies are there to be protecting and serving the community, but he was using them just for his own personal use and pulling them away from possibly protecting and serving the community. One of those people who was against Sheriff Dorsey and believed he was corrupt and knew he was doing all these things was Deputy Derwin Brown. Derwin wanted to rid the department of the corruption that had been going on. He wanted to clean slate. He wanted there to be, I think, 37 or 38 deputies that he determined were really not qualified to be on the deputies list because the sheriff had just hired people kind of that he knew off the streets, who had no qualifications for this. So Derwin Brown's like, okay, if you elect me as sheriff, I'm going to get rid of this corruption. I'm going to get all this out of here. I'm going to get rid of these 37, 38, whatever, people who should not be working as deputies. So he would run against Sidney for sheriff. In July or August of 2000, the election for the next sheriff would actually go into a runoff election. When the runoff election happened, it was in about August or so, then Derwin Brown won. So Sheriff Sidney Dorsey was now about to be out of a job and possibly be revealed as a corrupt individual, could possibly face some charges against him. On the evening of December 15th, 2000, it was 3 days before Derwin Brown would be taking over the role of sheriff, and the transfer of power would have to be done. Well, Derwin was arriving home in his vehicle with his wife, and they were just at a family function. And so they both get out of the car. Derwin begins to walk across the driveway, and then all of a sudden a hooded figure, a man they believed, kind of came out of the shadows, pointed a gun at him, at Derwin, and fired at least 12 rounds, hitting Derwin Brown many, many times. In the back, he got shot in the spleen, in the chest, just sort of everywhere. Derwin would fall to the ground, collapsed, right in front of his wife, who was horrified at the time, of course. The individual who did this just fled the scene, and Phyllis called 911, and when they arrived, unfortunately, Derwin Brown would be pronounced dead at the scene. He had been shot a total of 12 times. The first suspect in this case was pretty obvious. It was Sidney Dorsey. They didn't waste any time saying, let's look at this guy, because he just lost the election. He's possibly corrupt. His opponent, who is now dead, was saying he was going to go against him and possibly put charges on him and all this. So it's pretty obvious. But they, of course, would need proof. And they really didn't have to wait long to find reasons to believe that their theories were true. A man by the name of Patrick Cuffey was arrested for completely unrelated charges. Cuffey was once employed by Sidney Dorsey in his security firm. He was also a member of the Internal Affairs Department in the Deputies Department. He had been hired by Sidney Dorsey. When he was being questioned by police for the unrelated charges, the conversation of Derwin Brown's murder came up. And after a few hours, Patrick Cuffey, he basically named Sidney Dorsey as the one who masterminded the entire murder plot. What? Shocker. Oh my God. Who would have thought? In late August or early September of 2000, Sidney Dorsey would ask Patrick Cuffey to come to his house. When Patrick arrived, Dorsey handed him a handwritten note, and the note just said, "Kill Derwin Brown." Cuffey at first was like, no way. But then Dorsey essentially convinced him. And then Cuffey was like, well, I'm not doing this alone. I'm going to need help. So Dorsey says, well, hire a couple of guys to assist you with this, to do it however you need to do it. So he hires 3 former members of the Security Investigations Division, or SID, which was Dorsey's private security firm. He enlisted Melvin Walker, David Ramsey, and Paul Skyers to help with this murder plot. And apparently they all just agreed, okay, let's do it. This is because allegedly Dorsey had promised all 4 men high-ranking roles, or at least jobs, in the sheriff's department once he got reelected to sheriff. You see, because killing the newly elected sheriff, Derwin Brown, well, if he's dead, that means a special election is going to need to be held, and who better than to run for that than the guy who's been doing it the past several years. So he was like, once we kill him, I'll be reelected. Police would interview a woman by the name of Shirley McMichael, who was a bondsperson, but also a woman that Dorsey was having a sexual affair with. She told police that almost immediately after Dorsey lost the runoff election, he told her, quote, "Brown will never serve office as sheriff, and a special election will be done in January, and I will be elected." She told police that as he was saying this, he did the gesture of the gun to his head, pulling the trigger, signifying that possibly Derwin Brown would be shot. Another witness would also be interviewed. His name was Clarence Mosley, and he was the DeKalb County, the chief deputy. He told police that Dorsey said to him shortly after losing the election something pretty similar. He said, quote, "Brown will never be sworn into office. An interim sheriff will be put into place. And then in January, there's going to be a special election, and I'm going to obviously win it." Did these people at the time never, question why he was saying these things? Why did he know that he would not be, that Brown wouldn't be sworn into office? Did any red flags shoot up? Anything? So, anyway, now 4 men are essentially hired to murder Derwin Brown. Paul Skyers, one of the 4 men, he was the one to provide the actual murder weapon, which was a Tech 9mm semi-automatic handgun. And then they made their own silencer to attach to the weapon. Apparently, the 4 men literally drew straws to find out who would be the one to actually pull the trigger. And Melvin Walker apparently was the winner of that draw, or loser, however you want to look at it. The 4 men would conduct surveillance on Derwin Brown and his comings and goings and his daily routines. They watched his every move. Apparently one night, Cuffy used his sheriff's department vehicle, because he was employed with them still, to drive to the neighborhood that Derwin Brown lived in. He parked his car at a school in that neighborhood, and then he would get out of it, get into another vehicle that had the other 3 men, and then they would do their surveillance. Well, another DeKalb County Sheriff's deputy was just sort of in the area. He sees this now empty sheriff's vehicle and kind of wonders what's going on, because he thinks he saw that same vehicle in the same area the night before and possibly a couple other times before. So in this particular evening, he sees another car drive up to that sheriff's vehicle, and Patrick Cuffy gets out of the car with that 3 other men are inside, and then he proceeds to try to get into the sheriff's car. Now, he's in street clothes, getting into a sheriff's vehicle. So the sheriff's deputy wasn't super familiar with them because Cuffy worked in internal affairs, so they didn't really work together. So the deputy approaches Patrick Cuffy, and he asks Cuffy for his ID. Cuffy says, "I don't have my ID, so I can't give it to you." So what Cuffy does is he takes out his cell phone and he calls the sheriff, Sheriff Sidney Dorsey. And then he hands the phone to the deputy, and Dorsey on the phone tells the deputy, "Don't worry about him. He's doing an undercover surveillance mission, and so that's why he's in street clothes. He's good. Don't worry about it." So the deputy lets Cuffy go. So now, on December 15th, 2000, like I said, we're a couple of days away from Derwin Brown taking over the role as sheriff. So Dorsey tells the four men, you have to do this tonight because I'm about to lose my job, which means the four of you won't get these cool jobs and promotions that I promised you. So you got to do this tonight and now. So the four men get into one car and they drive to Derwin Brown's neighborhood and they park it in a secluded, like, wooded area, kind of covered by darkness. Paul Skyers was the getaway driver, so he stayed in the car. And then Melvin Walker gets out of the car because he's the one who's going to be approaching the house to do the shooting. The other two men are just sort of there. I don't know what their role was supposed to be in all of this. So they were just sort of in the car or outside the car or whatever, but not really doing anything. Walker approaches the Brown residence as they pull into their driveway. Mr. Brown gets out of the car. He is then confronted by the shooter, who says nothing and then just fires 12 rounds into him, and the shooter runs. So Walker then flees back to the car, where then Skyers starts it up and they speed away. They communicate to Dorsey that the job is done, and then they all go to Patrick Cuffey's house, where they dismantle the gun, and then Paul Skyers takes those gun parts, drives them to Gwinnett County, and then he disposes of all of those parts into like a drainage area, drainage ditch. The only actual money that I can see was ever exchanged was Dorsey gave Skyers like $1,000 in cash because he was in desperate need of money for something. But really the payment was going to be the jobs, the new roles in the department. So basically, Patrick Cuffey is relaying all of this information to the investigators. So he is put into lockup, and then they also arrest Paul Skyers to interview him. He readily admits to his role, and then he actually ends up taking police to where he discarded the gun, and they find it, all the parts, and so they're able to retrieve the murder weapon. Patrick Cuffey and Paul Skyers would end up taking a deal from the prosecution. They would get full prosecutorial immunity, meaning they will not be prosecuted for anything involving this crime if they testify against Sidney Dorsey, obviously, and also the shooter. There was trials for Melvin Walker and David Ramsey. I believe they were just like, they were acquitted in like these two, I guess, state trials. I'm not sure, but then they were prosecuted on federal charges. And Melvin Walker went on trial again in 2005, and he was found guilty and convicted of all charges, including murder and conspiracy to commit murder for hire, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. What Dorsey promised him was he would be promoted to deputy sheriff. Wah wah, doesn't get to happen. David Ramsey was determined somehow to be the backup shooter in case Walker somehow backed out or chickened out. He was promised by Dorsey to get a job as a detention officer. I'm not sure that's really worth killing someone for. None of this is, but that really. But he too was found guilty and convicted of the exact same charges and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Both of those men would claim that Cuffey and Skyers, they were the real shooters. They were the killers. They did all of this. And you gave them a deal. I mean, and that could very well be true, but who really truly knows? In July of 2002, Sidney Dorsey went on trial for conspiracy to commit murder, and he was charged also with malice murder, as well as charges of racketeering and the corruption type stuff that he had been doing and was proven while he was sheriff. And he was convicted of all charges, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and he got an additional 23 years for all of the racketeering charges. By the way, in 2002, Patrick Cuffey was actually sentenced to 12 months in prison for a completely unrelated case. He was charged and convicted of tampering with evidence in a drug-related shooting. At any rate, did Sidney Dorsey just really not think this through? This is a man who is publicly accused of sexual harassment, assault, publicly accused of corruption and racketeering by the opponent he was going to be facing for the new sheriff's election. And so if that opponent who wins is murdered days before he was to be sworn in, did he not think that the very first suspect would be him? To me, this has to be just one of the dumbest murder for hire plots, because it's obvious, like, he is obviously going to be the suspect. Like, why? Whatever. It baffles me. In 2007, this is years after he was convicted, he would openly admit that he did orchestrate the murder for hire plot. But then he says, because he doesn't want to actually confess to being involved in the actual murder, he says, well, I called it off. I said, we're not doing this anymore, but the four men decided to do it on their own. I had no involvement at that point. Well, even if you want to believe that, you still orchestrated it. You're the reason why it happened. So, sadly, in 2003, Phyllis Brown, who was Derwin's widow, she passed away in her 50s from a stroke. But she at least got to see some of the justice done against, for her husband. In the years since, a couple of memorials have gone up in Derwin's name. They have a Derwin Brown Memorial Bridge. And then in 2013, a new DeKalb County precinct was named after Derwin Brown, named in his honor. So that's pretty cool. Just wish it wasn't for the reasons, why. But that is it for this case. I hope you found it interesting. As usual, if you want to see more cases from me here on YouTube, please subscribe. I have a whole bunch more videos on here now. I have included a lot of compilation videos made from all of the stuff I've made over on TikTok that I'm getting put over here into compilation videos. They're usually about 40 minutes to an hour long on average, because I have like thousands of videos over on TikTok where I have 3 million followers almost, but they're a trash app at this point. So hi, welcome to YouTube, Mike. So yeah, please give me a subscribe. I post videos at least twice a week. It'll be more coming soon. So secondly, if you have a case you would like me to cover, please send me an email to mikey@truecrimerer.com. It's listed below. Before you do, go to my link tree below, check the Crimerer case list, look for the name you want me to cover. If you do not see it, then email me just the name, where it happened, when it happened, and I'll add it to my list. If you see the name already on there, please do not email me the name. It's already there. I pick my cases at random, so it'll happen eventually. I just can't tell you when. If you want to support me in any way, we do sell merch, including this cool shirt that says, "The Owl Did It," with the staircase. If you know the Michael Peterson staircase case, at one point an owl was accused, so that's where that's where it all comes from. So you can purchase this shirt, as well as other shirts and hoodies and wine glasses and stuff over in my merch store, which is in the link tree below. Lastly, if you have Discord and you want to join my server, you can. It's also in the link tree below, but just be over the age of 18. If not, you will be kicked out. Sorry, not sorry, but that's just the rules. All right, true crime maroonies, that's it for this case. So until the next time, I have a Post-it on my head. Oh, it's gone. What? I'm not. It's not the best way to end a video.